So the concept of spirituality was brought up. I don't think I had an adequate answer. I still don't have an adequate answer, but let's at least try to understand what it even means to ask that question. Spirituality to me refers to the idea that um, basically the consciousness survives the death of the body. That is what I think of when someone says spirituality. I think of, so you're basically telling me that you think your mind, your consciousness, your identity, who you are in some way, you survive the death of your body. Now, this isn't like a universal definition of spirituality. The Buddhists, for example, have a conception of spirituality which does not necessitate any kind of individuality. So we can conceive of spirituality, although some people could even contend that Buddhism is not spiritual, that it is anti-spiritual. There's certainly a lot of Western um, secularists, we'll call them, people who are scientific minded, who really admire Buddhism. So there are a couple of explanations about why spirituality exists. The first one is that it is an error, it is false, it is wrong, it's a big joke. Spirituality led to the 30 Years' War. Spirituality kills people. Spirituality causes destruction and chaos. It impedes progress. It impedes science. And so because of spirituality, we had the Dark Ages. If we got rid of spirituality, we would have had, the Roman Empire would have lived on. They would have invented rocket ships. We'd already be to the moon by now. So there is a very negative view of spirituality, which really doesn't seek to explain it, except to say that it's a form of insanity. It's a disease, in the same way that sexist people would call feminism a meme which spreads not because of its virtue, not because it creates some kind of utility, but it spreads because it itself is addictive. It itself has a spreading power. People use the example in biology. They'll say spirituality is like a virus. That is, they will say that spirituality is similar to an organism which feeds off other organisms. So spirituality is an organism which feeds off us, which confuses us, which distracts us from the truth. This is very similar to Kurt Doolittle's conception of Abrahamism, of mysticism, as something which distracts us from the true, distracts us from the scientific, from the empirical, from the material, and ultimately serves to destroy us. We could then go over to Nietzsche and the way that he talks about Christianity. Of course, I think Nietzsche himself has some form of spirituality. He believes in eternal return. He believes in reincarnation. But, if we're to look at Nietzsche's opinion on Christianity in certain ways, the idea that Christianity is a tool, it's a weapon. And here's where we get into the second part of spirituality, where spirituality is not arbitrary, it's not accidental, it's not random, it's not a virus, it is not a thing which self-perpetuates without purpose, but that it's a tool of the ruling class. This is sort of a Marxist analysis. Marx said religion is the opiate of the people. So here we see that spirituality is not merely accidental, but spirituality is purposeful. Spirituality was constructed with the subjugation of the herd in mind, the subjugation of the lower classes. Nietzsche talks about the power of the priest is in the priest's ability to control the herd with religion, with language, with magic. So we've moved from a view of spirituality where it is like a malignant tumor, that is, it is cancerous, that is, it is random, to another view in which spirituality is still evil, it's still wrong, it's still inhibiting, it inhibits us, it limits us, it's bad. But there is a purpose to it. It is the war of the upper class against the lower class. It's the war of the priest against the warrior. So here, rather than being an arbitrary poison, here spirituality is a purposeful poison, that it has a purpose in mind, that it is powerful. And I think this has much more explanatory power than the previous idea that spirituality is just like random, accidental. I think most people tend toward a conspiratorial view of spirituality. If they're critical of spirituality, um, they'll say things like, "Why do you believe in God? You don't have a reason to believe in God. It's arbitrary. It's not founded in empiricism." You move from that. I think at some point, if you push people who are secularists, who are atheists, you push them hard enough, they'll eventually get to the second frame, which is that spirituality was constructed purposefully. Daniel Dennett starts to get in here, where we're talking about the evolutionary foundation of spirituality. Where does it come from? What Darwinian advantage does it give us? So we're talking about spirituality, the purpose behind it, the genealogy of it, the origins, the etymology. Where does all this spirituality come from? Here, the secularist is still presupposing that spirituality is a bad thing, but at least it has some rhyme and reason. At least it's not just pure madness, pure accident, like a mutation or something. It really, we're talking about psychology here. We're talking about the difference between someone who would say something like, well, this man has schizophrenia because of a gene mutation. A gene mutation caused this person to have low IQ or schizophrenia or some problem. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no positive corollary. There's no, it's not a symptom of something greater. It's not a byproduct. It's not a means justified by an ends. It is merely an accident, merely a mutation. Whereas in the second view, spirituality doesn't arise accidentally. Spirituality arrives purposefully. Here it is, one class of people is using spirituality, constructing it in order to oppress another class. Now we get into a third view of spirituality, which is not sociological in nature, but rather it is individual in nature and psychological in nature, which says that spirituality was invented to solve the problem of humanity, the problem of consciousness. That is, we, by our nature, react to perceived reality with fight or flight or fear or attraction or repulsion. And my ear is really itchy. I don't know why. But right now I'm attracted to the idea of itching my ear, and I'm repulsed by the idea of my ear being itchy. I wish it would go away. But it's not just the immediacy of the itch. The itch is not something I've consciously invented. It's part of, my animal chimpanzee mind. We don't require consciousness. We see animals itch themselves. Animals get itchy and animals itch themselves. And this psychology has been continued into the human mind. So the human mind has a reactive component to that. That is, most of our behavior, most of our psychology is an emotional system which is derived from a pre-conscious set of organisms known as animals. So cats and dogs and all manner of animals perceive realities. They have sensory experience. Oh, there is a predator. I'm afraid. I'm going to run away. Oh, there is a mating partner. I'm attracted. I'm going to approach. There is food. I'm going to hunt after that food. So there is the immediacy of perceived reality, and there is an instantaneous reaction. Consciousness, that is, and I'm sort of defining consciousness here in a way that's probably not necessarily standard or accurate or really encompasses what it means. But for the moment, we're just going to say consciousness is the ability to rise above the immediacy of the moment and invent imaginary realities in order to construct both past and future. So what consciousness allows us to do is to remember the past and say, in the past, I did this and that didn't work out so well. And that is going to influence our present behavior. Or, in the future, this might happen. So therefore, I'm going to, work this job that I don't like because in the future, I'll get a paycheck, which I do like. So consciousness is the ability to simulate realities in your head. It's not removing or replacing the action, reaction, emotional system of animal and the animal world, but it's taking abstractions like paycheck and equating them with a sensory experience like getting drunk or having sex or eating food. So we equate abstractions ultimately with dopamine, endorphins. We don't necessarily have words for these things. We've now done the biochemistry and seen the material connection there that we can test in the laboratory. But you don't need to be conscious of the process for the process to be going on. So we have this ability, but there's a huge problem that comes with this ability, because our ability to project into the future does not stop with 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. There is no hard limit on the futurology of consciousness. And that's a problem, because individual human beings have finite lifespans. So we are all able to project into a future where we no longer exist. And this creates a paradox, because in order for us to perceive reality, we have to at the same time have the sensation of being alive. The idea of being able to perceive reality while being dead creates a paradox, because everything that we perceive, in that perception, there is some, Cartesian concept of I think, therefore I am. We cannot conceive of the thinking process without the living process, of the being process. So to conceive of a reality where we do not exist is like to conceive of once we understand that perception is a verb, perception is something we actively do as part of our living process, it creates a paradox. And this paradox, I think, is what Lovecraft is trying to get at when he depicts the non-Euclidean geometry of the world of Cthulhu. He's trying to get at this idea of we don't fear hell anymore. The medieval peasantry feared hell because in their own lives, they didn't have an existential conflict. They had spirituality. That was not a problem. The problem was, your parents might beat you, or you have to carry water a long way, or if you commit a crime, you're going to get your fingernails torn off. So what people feared in their day-to-day life was not something existential. The church took care of that. What they feared in their day-to-day life was pain, hunger, pain, physical torture. Even with the Greeks, you see this Prometheus steals fire. And there's no existential torture that goes on. It's a physical torture that these birds, these vultures eat his guts out. The gods heal his guts perpetually so that they can continue to be eaten. It is a physical torture, a physical pain. This is what ancient people, medieval people seem to fear the most, was this kind of physical pain. Or the pain of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is rolling the boulder up the hill. It's this physical labor. You can say there's some kind of redundancy there. There's some kind of repetition that adds onto the humiliation of his punishment. Or give another myth, the myth of the Minotaur. The Minotaur is not scary because he asks tough questions about existential philosophy. The Minotaur is scary because he's going to eat you, he's going to hurt you, he's going to kill you. So in this view, it is not that religion is an error, and it's not that religion was created by the priest to oppress the warriors, but that religion was created internally within the individual to solve a psychological problem. That is, we can project a future in which we no longer exist, and yet this creates a paradox because all other imagined universes of perception that we can generate within our minds involve some kind of tacit Cartesian logic that we ourselves exist, we ourselves are living. The way you solve this is by presupposing that we are eternal. We have eternal souls, whether it is through reincarnation, whether it is through heaven and hell, but that we somehow live, our existence is independent of our body. And this makes sense because we have the ability to imagine worlds where we are not living within our bodies. That is the idea of, I guess the popular term is astral projection, but everyone astrally projects all the time. Whenever you remember something from the past, you are remembering a scene that you are not presently in. So you're taking your mind and you're creating a reality, and you're existing in that reality which your real body is not currently in. Or you're projecting into the future. You're imagining maybe, and you can imagine in your head, you can imagine a situation in which you're in a room and there's two, or you're not in the room, but there are two people in the room talking to each other. Somehow your consciousness, somehow your perception is in that room. You're not. So we can imagine situations in which somehow our perceptual capabilities exist within an environment without our body necessarily existing in that environment. And so the fact that we can do that leads us to the belief that we exist independent of our body. If we did not exist independent of our body, then all of these imagined scenes that we create of past and future, or alternative events or dream events or fictional events, daydreaming, all of this would just not make sense. It would be paradoxical. So it follows. There's a positive experiential, like the act of imagining a different scene from which I am currently in. If I imagine right now that I'm on a desert island and I'm looking out at the waves, I can see the sky and I can see the horizon and I can see the patterns of the waves. Maybe I see a little seagull and all of that. Now, the fact that I'm able to do that implies to me that my mind is not tied to my body. If my mind was tied to my body, then I would never be able to imagine a scene other than that which I am in. The fact that I'm able to generate that scene implies that my mind, my consciousness is not tied to my body. Now, we can go back to the previous explanations and say, first of all, that's an error. We can say that's an error. My contention would be that how is this an error if it benefits us in evolutionary terms? Our ability to project past and future events in our imagination is extremely useful for our survival. So to call it an error seems to be a gross abuse of the term error. On the other hand, the Nietzschean idea or the Marxist idea that religion and spirituality was created by one class to oppress another class also fails, because here I'm imagining the beach scene, or I'm imagining the past, I'm imagining the future. I'm imagining, I can see the winter coming in my mind. And so in order to avoid starvation, I'm going to store up on food. This is clearly not one class oppressing another class. This is me helping myself. So the first view of spirituality, which is that spirituality is an error, just seems to be flat out wrong if we view it in this way. And then the second view, that spirituality is the tool of one class to oppress another class, also just doesn't explain. I mean, we can say that there are certain religions that are wrong, right? And we can say, oh, well, I'm a Christian and therefore I think the Buddhist view of spirituality is wrong. So it's not to say that, it's not, what I'm trying to say is that the view that spirituality is merely an error is not sufficient to explain it and to understand it. In some cases, spirituality might be called erroneous, but that cannot, in a totalistic sense, help us understand and totally map out what spirituality is in its essence. And then the sociological critique of spirituality, that is, it is purely a class conflict. I'm taking a Marxist term, but that also applies to Nietzsche. It's purely a tool of the priest class to oppress the warrior class. Well, that is not sufficient to explain spirituality either. Again, if we understand that the basis of spirituality is simply the statement that the mind or the consciousness or the self or the identity or the perceptual unit in a Cartesian sense is separate from the body in some sense, well, this is something we experience on a daily basis. And the more schizophrenic you are, the more creative you are, the more imaginative you are, the more spiritual you're going to be. The person who merely perceives what is in front of them is the perfect atheist. And in a sense, this is what the autistic person does. The autistic person cannot imagine another universe. The autistic person is focused on the here and now. The autistic person is focused upon the objects in front of them. And this is why the autistic person is obsessed with certain textures, because the autistic person does not have the imagination, the capability to divorce the mind from the body. And they are enslaved by their own senses. The autistic person cannot help but be bothered by the texture of potato chips. The autistic person is therefore fetishizing the texture and the feeling of their teddy bear. The autistic person is engrossed in the game called Minecraft. The autistic person is engrossed by StarCraft. The autistic person is engrossed by the field of objects in front of them, whether it be the clouds or counting the raindrops. The autistic person cannot escape the perceptual field. And so therefore the autistic person is in some way an atheist, in some way directly experiencing their reality. There is no distinction between the mind and body. The mind and body are always synonymous in an animalistic sense. Whereas the schizophrenic person, the creative person, the spiritual person, the person who imagines past and future, the person who daydreams, the person who looks out the car window and has conversations with themselves and imagines themselves on the stage and giving a speech to a large audience of hundreds or thousands of people. This type of person is biased toward the spiritual. Now, in terms of cultural signaling, secularism has become a badge of honor. It's become a status signal. That is, if you call yourself a secularist, an atheist, an agnostic, you are associating yourself with the educated. You're associating yourself with academia. You're associating yourself with smart people and intelligent people. And so I think there are people who are very creative on the left, people who are artists, people who are into theater, who are into, acting, who describe themselves as atheists because what atheism means to them is not an experiential, Cartesian philosophy. It's not, experiential in the way that Schopenhauer described, the experience of the body, the perception of the body. But it's a status signal. It's saying, I'm not patriarchal, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist, I'm not Christian, I'm not Eurocentric. And the extent to which they do respect religion, or they're interested in religion or spirituality, the extent to which they're deferential to it, is exactly correlated with the precepts and dogmas of leftism. So when you ask someone who is an atheist or an agnostic, what do you think about Christianity? Oh, it's stupid, it's terrible, it's nonsensical. If you ask them, what do you think about Islam, Buddhism, Judaism? They'll say, well, I'm an atheist, but it's very interesting, or I'm respectful, or whatever. We shouldn't criticize that. So you can see in the contradictions there that the atheist is not really concerned with like an experiential philosophy of understanding what these concepts really mean, but they see them as status signals. So this produces a whole lot of confusion, because you have people who really are not atheists in the way that I'm using that term, who still nonetheless identify as atheists, basically for political and sociological reasons of status signaling. And that creates a lot of confusion. And one way that you can cut through that confusion is by asking them, well, what do you think about non-European religions? Would you subject those to the same level of derision that you do Christianity? And often they have a double standard, and that's kind of where the sociological origin of their self-identification is to be found. Whereas those autistic people who really do hate religion in a pure form, and maybe Richard Dawkins could be counted among them. He's waffled back and forth on these kinds of issues. But there are certainly people who are like, yeah, I hate all religions equally, not just Christianity, but all the religions. And that's the point at which it ceases to be a status signal. And it's an authentic expression of the fact that they have a very tenuous, loose, or weak ability to project their consciousness outside of their body. They cannot imagine the past or future. They are stuck in the sensory experience of the immediate present, in the sensuousness of the immediate present. Whereas the creative person, the schizophrenic person, the imaginative person is less so in this current world, in the room that they're in. They are more so in an imaginative world, in a future world, in a past world, a nostalgia, a fantasy, a fiction. So this is one way to think about what spirituality is in a really basic way. And therefore, when we ask the question, like, are you spiritual, or are you, what are your thoughts on spirituality? Which spiritual path do you take? I think this is one way to start looking at that question is, are you someone who is concerned with the immediacy of the present, of the empirical, of what is before you? Or are you concerned more with your imagination of fiction, of perceived potentialities, of ideals, of a telos? What are you more concerned with? And I think that's a way to start answering that question. Very few people are going to be absolutely one way or the other way. There are some people who imagine demons, who imagine ghosts, who imagine all kinds of spirits surrounding them at all times. They think they're hearing gods, demons, all kinds of voices. They're seeing things. This is obviously a very extreme version of what I'm talking about. And very few people are like that. Very few people go through a day-to-day life and hear voices in their head. They hear gods, they hear demons, they see creatures which other people do not perceive. Very few people are like this. Very few people, and perhaps none, although, this would be a little more difficult to prove, but there are very few people who I'm trying to be strict with my definitions here. I know I play fast and loose, but I'm trying to be careful with how I say this. There are very few people who do not have the ability to imagine past or future. Now, maybe in some sense, children do not have the ability to imagine past or future. They are immediately in their situation, and therefore you can see that from their emotions. When something bad happens to a child, they eat a lemon and they cry. They are yelled at and they cry. They see something happen suddenly and they cry. They hear a loud noise, they cry. On the other hand, they eat a piece of candy and they're happy. They see some peekaboo and they laugh, and they hear some pretty music and they clap along and they want to dance. So children, in this sense, are very much in the immediacy of their moment, and they cannot disassociate. They cannot project their consciousness into their imagination. The moment when the child is able to get lost in a world of his own, when does that exactly come? And how do we differentiate these two types of behaviors and these two psychologies? Because there are often very young children who have an ability. I think it's also has to do with your introversion versus extroversion. But there are clearly children where you can give them a paper bag. You can set them in a room alone with Legos or some little action figures, and they can spend hours playing and imagining a world, imagining a narrative, making believe. And you get kids together and they want to pretend, oh, I'm the mommy, I'm the daddy, I'm the princess, I'm the queen. So the ability of children to create imaginary scenes and to imbue items with a fetishistic power, they'll take a paper bag and they'll say, this is the crown of the kingdom. And another child takes the bag and rips it apart and they start crying. Well, it's just a paper bag. We have 1,000 different paper bags, they're not exactly expensive. But the child has imagined that the paper bag is not simply a paper bag in its sensory, textual, its touch and feel, but that the paper bag is imbued with the power of the kingdom, and they've imagined the social status that it has, and all of these things, the ability to defeat dragons or whatever. So these behaviors appear very early on. They are prior to any kind of rational arguments about the nature of consciousness, the nature of matter, and all the things that I'm talking about. But we engage with these psychological processes from a very young age. When exactly does it begin, and which comes first? I would be inclined in evolutionary sense to say that the autistic function, that is the perceptual function of the body being inseparable from the scene itself. That is, the fact that I am perceiving is proof to me that I'm in my body and not somewhere else. I would suppose that is primary, because I would suppose that in evolutionary history, animals first exist as action, reaction, perceiving units without the ability to project past and future. It is only later in our evolutionary history that we start being able to represent imaginary scenes which are not contemporary to our present experience. So in terms of child development, seems to develop along these striations of homunculus structures. That is, when you look at fetuses, the rabbit fetus and the giraffe fetus and the human fetus and the rat fetus, all of these different fetuses together look quite similar in their early development. And then as you go through the gestation process, they become more and more and more different. If you look at the two most closely related species to humans, like chimpanzees or bonobos, that the chimpanzees and humans look very, 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 very similar as fetuses within the womb, for months in the womb, perhaps, or weeks, or whatever the time scale is. But they look very similar, and it's almost impossible to distinguish or differentiate them until such a time as they've matured in order to show this different genetic expression. It's also interesting to watch the way that the DNA begins to express itself as the basically the sperm and the egg in a most basic duocellular system, a twin cell system of sperm and egg. They come together and they start to trace these lines and these contours and organs and speciate themselves. And this process is very similar in the initial stages, and then more and more distinguishes these different species over time. So, my theory of mind is very much a Gebserian view that the development of the fetus and the development of the mind and evolution itself are all tied together. And so I would presuppose that spirituality is in some way something unique to humans, to the extent that consciousness is unique to humans. I don't view consciousness necessarily as a black and white thing. I think certain animals do have this ability to project future and past states. To what extent that is true, I'm not sure. Is it simply Pavlovian training that we see, or do dogs really have the ability to imagine the reward in their heads in some way? Do they have the ability to simulate the taste of the treat before they actually receive the treat? So these are complicated questions to answer, but I'm not going to say that human consciousness is exclusive from animal consciousness, or that there's no such thing as animal consciousness. But it seems clear that we've developed this consciousness, this ability to imagine fictional worlds which do not include our body, or in which this imagined world is separate from our body in the present, in the quote unquote real world, in the non-imagined world. Although then this gets into the question of realism of, is the world that we are perceiving truly the real world, or is it an imaginary world in itself? And maybe that's going to get us too far afield. I don't think I'm prepared to talk about that. I wasn't prepared to talk about spirituality yesterday, so I don't think I'm prepared to talk about realism in a general sense today. But yeah, it seems to me that humans have developed spirituality in very much a correlated fashion with our ability to imagine a world without our body. And so this is where the distinction between the mind and the body comes from. Again, referencing someone like Gebser, the magical consciousness structure versus the mental consciousness structure. Human beings which do not have a conception necessarily of heaven or hell, or the gods up there, or the Platonic realm, but their concept of quote unquote spirituality is very much an immediate spirituality of the demons live in the forest and we can hear them at night, and the stars in the sky, those are our ancestors. So primitive quote unquote religion, or primitive quote unquote spirituality often is much more immediate to the sensory perception. I can hear, monkeys in the forest and I call them demons. I can see stars in the sky, call those the ancestors. There's still abstraction going on. There's still some elements of imagination going on. And that's an interesting thing about, when people die, we can still imagine their personalities and the kinds of things they would say and do, even though they are dead. So in a sense, we have internalized their own personality within our personality. We've created these sub-layers of personality within us. And like, even as people die, they live on within us in a literal sense, and that we are able to reconstruct things that they might say or might do in response to new events. That's pretty incredible. So the idea that people live on after they're dead, again, is something that we experience through our imagination. When someone dies, I still have the ability to talk to that person, ask them questions, and imagine what kind of answers they might have. And the closer I am to that person, the more I know that person, the better I'm able to construct those things. So, there's just an experiential way in which spirituality is not really a choice, but it's a facet of our psychology. The question is, to what extent is it real? Maybe we do have to go into realism. Maybe we do have to understand what we mean by that term real. When we say that the room I am in is real, these walls are real, that is, they impose certain limits on my behavior, right? So I cannot simply walk through that wall. If I try to, I'm going to bump into the wall. If I punch the wall, it will provide resistance. So that is the sense in which the wall is real. Now, if I say, not only is there a wall over there, but there's a wall right in front of my nose, and I can't move, I can't push through this wall. It would say that's not real, that's imaginary. Of course I can push through that wall. Of course I can push through that wall. The mime is the character who imagines, oh, there's walls around me. We say those walls are not real. And the reason for that is that collectively, while the mime may pretend that he cannot move through the wall, we can walk up to the mime and push all around the air around him. There's not going to be anything solid there. He's just mimicking or pretending that there is a wall. He's acting as if there is a wall when there is none. And it's very entertaining. But we understand that collectively, if any one of us went up to the mime and pushed him up against that wall, he would simply fall over. There would be no wall to support him. So the question of what is real and not real, when we consider this vastness of our imagination, the power of the imagination to create things which are not real, really what we mean by reality is not the individual empiricism, not the individual understanding of what is or isn't real, but it is this collective sense of reality that is implicit within questions of realism. That is, if I say God is real and you say, prove it to me, and I say, well, I can hear him talking to me, and you say, well, I can't, then by a social definition, a collective definition, God is not real, right? Because I can hear him, but you can't. I can see him, but you can't. And therefore, there's like a social aspect when we're talking about reality. Now, whenever we're talking about sociality, we, of course, have to bring it to linguistics and authority. So when I say something like black holes are real, have you ever seen a black hole? You might have seen an artist's depiction of a black hole. You might have seen, something, you might have heard the term black hole before. You might have heard a scientist on TV like Neil deGrasse Tyson say, black holes are the densest. This is not an imitation of him. This is just an excited scientist. Black holes, he's educating the public. Black holes are the densest objects in the known universe. And you hear Neil deGrasse Tyson, or you hear Carl Sagan, or you hear Richard Feynman, or whoever it is, talk about black holes, and then someone asks you, are black holes real? And you say, yeah, I've heard of black holes. That's the response. I've heard of black holes. Well, have you seen them? Have you experienced them? Have you touched them? Do you have some kind of intimate sensual experience with black holes? Well, no, I couldn't, because they would kill me. I couldn't because they're too far away. I couldn't because, and you can give reasons why you've never experienced a black hole, or you've never confirmed the existence of a black hole. You take the black hole's existence, you take its reality on authority, the authority of a scientist. And similarly, when someone walks out of church and an atheist runs up to them and sticks a microphone in their face and says, do you believe in God? Is God real? And they say, yeah. And you say, well, have you ever seen God? No, I've never seen God. Well, can you show me God? Can you touch God? Do you have a sensory experience of God? No, I don't. But, well, how do you know God is real? Well, I read my Bible and I listen to my pastor. And So you're making an appeal to authority in both cases. On the one hand, you're saying the scientists told me black holes are real and therefore they are real. In the other case, you're saying the Bible said it or the pastor said it and therefore God is real. So ultimately, when we talk about the reality of things, it is a social experience and it's also an authoritative experience. If we ask, is spirituality real? Do you believe in spirituality? Is it fake or is it real? This is a question of our social position, and it's also a question of which authorities we are under. I talked about this yesterday in terms of the political. The ideology that we ascribe to is a function of our sociality and the authorities that we subjugate ourselves to, or we are subjugated by, depending on our level of agency. But here we're talking about spiritual questions, and it's very much the same thing. Who has authority, the scientist or the priest? Increasingly, the power structures of society, the media, the military, the money power, they are instructing us through propaganda, through public schools, through popular education, through film and entertainment. They're instructing us that the priest really doesn't have any social authority, whereas the scientist does. And to be a God denier is just a choice. To be a God denier is an opinion. To be a God denier is correct. Whereas to be a climate denier is evil. To be a climate denier is ignorant. To be a climate denier is immoral. Because to be a climate denier is to reject not just climate change, but really a climate denier is symptomatic of someone who distrusts the authority of science and the scientists. And that's the problem with climate denial. I don't really care too much about climate change in general. I don't care because I'm not a person who is afraid of flying on planes. Maybe if I was afraid of traveling in a car, flying on a plane, or maybe if I had $1 million house on the beach, I would be a little scared about climate change because you're telling me the sea levels might rise. Well, my house might be underwater. There goes my whole life's investment. But if you're telling me sea levels are going to rise, well, I can move. If you're a poor person, if you're a poor person living in an island nation, a poor person living in a coastal city, they say and they claim that, oh, well, all these poor people are going to be homeless. All these poor people are going to be underwater, their homes destroyed, their livelihoods destroyed. But poor people really don't have a lot of investments. Poor people usually rent their homes. It's the landlords who will lose out. It's the landlords who will bear the financial catastrophe of rising sea levels. Poor people, they will rent in a coastal city, and then if it ends up flooding, they'll rent somewhere else. Maybe they have a year-long lease, whereas for the landlord, he has spent his life's investment. Perhaps it's inherited from his ancestors. And so climate change is going to be, if it is, as I don't know the timetables because they keep getting updated, but let's say in 10 years, New York City will be underwater. Well, that's going to have a very similar effect as like Henry VIII selling off the monastic properties. It's just going to shake up the economy. It's going to create capitalist opportunity. It's going to lead to the growth of new cities on the interior of the continent. It's going to lead to the opening up, perhaps, of Antarctica. It's going to open up new Arctic shipping lanes. It's going to open up Siberia as fertile farmland. It's going to cause more desertification in the Middle East. And I think that's a valid point. If you live in Egypt, you live in Israel, you live in Saudi Arabia, if the planet warms up just a little bit, the desertification that's going to happen could be quite detrimental to your economy, your access to clean drinking water, the expensiveness of that. There is a process by which we can desalinization can turn ocean water into drinking water, but that's quite expensive. So that's a cost on your country if you're thinking in terms of nation states. So if you live in the Middle East or something like that, or you live on an island nation and you're afraid about your country existing in the future, climate change is something to be worried about. But for the rest of us, for other people for whom that is not the situation, it's not such an imminent threat. You sort of have to be either a global citizen or a person who's like very invested in the stock market, and you don't want anything disruptive to happen. In that sense, maybe climate change is a threat. But it's just interesting for me to think about in terms of the question of which authority do we ascribe to, what is our social position. That's really what inframes a question like spirituality. So we can't really answer these questions or authentically understand the scope of what we're discussing if we don't first acknowledge that to reject spirituality or certain types of spirituality, again, first and foremost, rejecting Christianity or rejecting fundamentalist Christianity is important as a status signaling move, as a behavior, as a mentality. You can embrace to some extent Buddhism or Islam or Judaism. You can embrace those kinds of spiritualities and not be thought of as low class or dumb. But we have to understand that there is an element of authority implicit within the language that we're using. So you ask me to speak a few sentences about spirituality. That's something we have to acknowledge, right? I mean, that is what Foucault would say. We have to, or Foucault, I'm sorry, I keep saying Foucault. Foucault would say we have to analyze the power relations of these linguistic structures before we begin to actually talk about them in themselves. Chomsky would say a similar thing. We have to examine the linguistic biases at play. So those are all very interesting things to think about and then the collective impact of religion in a majoritarian sense, in a minoritarian sense, to understand all of these aspects. I've said before, and I'll say now, that if it can be proven on an individual or collective level that religion or spirituality somehow benefits collectives or groups or individuals, propagate themselves, enrich themselves, gain power for themselves, then those who embrace that will survive, will live, will thrive and dominate, whereas those who reject it will suffer. There's been a lot of talk about pornography recently, and some people saying, let's ban it for everybody. And then other people say, no, let's not ban it because it's good. But then there's a third section of people which say, no, let's not ban it because it is bad. And we should allow those who are psychologically weak and uninformed and ignorant and not part of our religion or our cultural structure, we should allow them to kill themselves so that we have a competitive advantage, relatively speaking. I think that's the basis of high-low versus the middle. I think that's the basis of social policy at large, is the idea that, yeah, let's create a minefield so that only people who are good mine detectors can survive. And this will sort of will be a process of elimination for the great majority of people who don't understand diet, they don't understand porn, they don't understand exercise, they don't understand religion or spirituality. These are people who are consumers, these are people who are replicators, they are not creative thinkers, they are not people who think of these deep questions by themselves. Although some people would counter that argument by saying that people who intelligence itself, as we've talked about with Zapfa, Mr. Zapfa from Norway, that he believed the intelligence could be like the antlers of a deer which grow too large and thus pin the deer to the ground. So there is an extent to which, as we philosophize about spirituality and we ask these questions and go back and forth and investigate different ideas, perhaps it would just be better if we were fanatical. And this was at one point a decision of a Romanian philosopher called Cioran, or Cioran, I'm not sure how you pronounce the Romanian. But this fellow essentially was a nihilist and a pessimist, didn't believe in anything, he moved to France, smoked a lot of cigarettes, and believed the universe was absurd and arbitrary and material and nothing really mattered. And he came to this point where he said, well, if all of that is true, as I do believe it is true, in the words of Cioran, or Sioran. Someone tell me how to say this, please. I really don't know. Okay, Google. Okay, Google. Sioran. Tell me the pronunciation of Sioran. Emil Sioran pronounce. Give me a good pronunciation here. Okay, tell me.
Pronouncenames.com.
Okay, thank you, Pronounce Names. Appreciate you.
Emil Choran.
Choran? Choran. Are you serious?
Choran.
Oh, Choran. Wow. So I said it's either Sioran or Kioran. It's Choran. Just when you think, I don't know what you think. Just when you think something or know something, it's totally the opposite. Okay, Chiron, he says, yeah, everything is stupid. Everything's arbitrary. Everything's absurd. We can't prove anything. Everything is just random. Let's smoke cigarettes. Let's move to France. Let's be sad. Let's be depressed. But then he stops himself at the end of all that and he says, well, if all of that is true, then why not just go wild? Why not just, if all of that is true, why not promote faith in something? If we get to this point with like postmodernist, atheist, deconstructions, Socrates, if we get to the point with skepticism and materialism, if we get to this point where it's like, yeah, nothing really matters, it's all kind of stupid, no point to life, it's sort of a suicidal place. If you get to that point, and then you sort of have this germ of an idea in the back of your head, it's like, well, if it's all silly and stupid and nonsensical, why not be a fanatic? Why not be faithful? Why not be authoritarian? Why not be monomaniacal? Why not be vitalistic? Why not be masculine? Why not be assertive and aggressive and warlike and conquering? And you can see this in a guy like Nietzsche in some way. I don't think he portrays the problem within himself. He sort of takes the depressive function and foists that off on the priest and Schopenhauer. He says, yeah, Schopenhauer is depressed, but me, Nietzsche, I'm sensuous, I'm life-affirming, I'm masculine, I'm vitalistic. And now, of course, Nietzsche in himself, you look at the guy and he was not very personally impressive in terms of, was he climbing mountains? Was he beating people up? Was he a great military thinker? Was he a great doer? Was he a great lover? Was he a progenitor of life? Was he natal? He talked about those things a lot. He didn't really do them. But Chiron, as we've now learned how, I'll probably forget it. I'll go back to calling him Kioran and Sioran. But Chiron, he said within himself, he had this own kind of Schopenhauer-Nietzsche dialectic within himself. So whereas, I mean, Nietzsche admits this, right? Nietzsche says, like, when I was a 13-year-old boy or when I was younger and I first read Nietzsche and I thought he was so great, and then I started to question Nietzsche and I started to question the English psychologists. So he kind of explains this process as being something in the past. He says, well, when I was younger and stupider, I was a fan of Schopenhauer. I was a fan of the priest class. I was a fan of the English psychologist. But then I grew out of that and I became Nietzschean and I became a warrior and the will to power, whatever. But within Chiron, what we actually see is there's 3 periods in his life. One where he's kind of depressed and nihilistic. And then a period in which he embraces fanaticism for the sake of fanaticism. He says, if everything's arbitrary, if nothing really matters, then why not just be crazy? Why not just go for it? Why not just be an animal? Why not just be bestial? Why not just embrace the most despotic authorities of violence and sexuality and eroticism and just throw yourself into that? Not in an individual sense, not in a libertarian sense, not in the sense of, yeah, if you want to have an orgy over there, or you want to be gay, or like, he wasn't saying it in that way. But he was saying if we've come to this point where we've deconstructed all of the glory of our civilization, all of the masculinity of our civilization, and we're left with nothing, Well, then he viewed this as a kind of a clean slate to reinvent everything from the ground up and to embrace power for the sake of power. So again, it is derivative of Nietzsche. But what's interesting about Cioran is that within his own writing, you can track his progression from being a depressive nihilist to then embracing fanaticism. And then he moves back to France. He becomes a depressive again. He goes back to being nihilistic and very pessimistic guy. But it's interesting to look at that when we talk about spirituality. We talk about the behaviors that surround spiritual beliefs. Someone who rejects spiritual beliefs tends to be more of a consumerist, a pacifist, a feminine, someone who's just going to let things happen to them, let the world happen to them. They're not interested in doing anything because what's the point? It's all material. I'm going to die anyway. We hear these things again and again. Whereas the spiritual person says, no, it is worth doing something because of Valhalla or heaven or God or the afterlife or reincarnation or there's something beyond this. There's something eternal. There's something driving me. There's something schizophrenic and creative and vital going on here. So they are pushed towards that. And in effect, that changes their behavior. And it is a sort of a flow state. It's like once you're in the thick of it, it's a self-perpetuating system. And so we can look at this again in a sociological sense. We're kind of, the original arguments I was making, I would say the first position, spirituality is erroneous. The second position is spirituality is a form of class warfare. And the third position, I think we said, was spirituality is the ability for the individual to overcome themselves and the paradox of perception and imagination. And then the fourth question is this question of spirituality as a means or a necessity for Darwinian survival and strength and vitality and things like that. Now, there is, of course, an authentic spirituality, which is not trying to justify spirituality or genealogically dissect spirituality, but it is the spirituality which is felt, the spirituality which is perceived. When you hear God speaking, that is true spirituality. That is the spiritual experience. We've been talking about spirituality. We've been orbiting this center called spirituality, never touching it, never having an imminent encounter with it. We have not been talking with God. You know, I haven't been listening to the muses and writing down what the muses have been telling me. I've simply been, telling you what I think. But that is that ultimately, while we can promote spirituality in the abstract sense, while we can give money to the church, or we can cynically and deceptively promote spirituality. Yes, I believe in God when secretly you don't. You're only saying that because you think it has some kind of utilitarian function. There are a lot of these secret atheists in various religious movements, I think. You can do that, but that is something different from the true, authentic spiritual encounter where you really do perceptually engage with something which is not of this world, which is not of the collective reality, so to speak. You run up against a wall which others don't perceive. You see or hear or feel the presence of something which no one else sees and feels and hears. So that real spiritual experience, it is something happening in the mind, in the consciousness that through dissection and analysis, we can never reach that point necessarily. Some people would say fake it till you make it. Maybe if we just push spirituality in an abstract sense, yeah, spirituality is sociologically good. And here's X, Y, Z, why it's good. It's natal. People who are spiritual have more children, blah, blah, blah. We can make all these kinds of arguments for spirituality, but it's never actually necessarily going to bring us in contact with the phenomenon itself. That is a very different thing. And what would bring us into contact with that in itself? And I think that would mean breaking down our psychological defenses against spirituality. That is, in our day-to-day lives, we exist as bourgeois consumers, bourgeois workers. We are existing in the material world. We're interacting with systems of authority and sociality that reinforce atheism, agnosticism, an anti-spiritual view. And so to bring ourselves out of that, we have to divest ourselves of the sociality and authorities of this world. One way to do that is to go into the jungle or the desert or the wilderness. And this is what the ascetics did. Traditionally, they left the sociality and authorities of their time, and they went to be on their own and to confront nature and to be confronted with dangers dangers of the mind and also dangers of the body, the dangers of thirst and starvation and coldness and heat, and these uncomfortable, painful experiences which push the brain to its very limits and tap into its emergency reserves. There is a concept of epigenetics where you never really express yourself until you're backed up against a wall. Your muscles don't express their potential until you overwork them. Your mind doesn't express its potential until you overwork it, until you submit yourself to the hostilities which the mind was evolved to confront, until you expose yourself to the harsh elements, the cold, the wind, the water, the rain, the heat of the sun, dehydration and starvation and pain, physical pain, the self-flagellation of the medieval priests. Until you confront that, maybe there is no method of abstraction or Thomistic dogmatic argumentation. You can listen to Jay Dyer argue with Catholics all day, or you can, get into the 4,000 different sects of Protestantism and listen to their theology. It's never going to lead to a direct confrontation with that spiritual part of yourself. If such a thing does exist, it seems the most direct and easiest way, rather than me lecturing about it, is to actually go out and have an experience. And going to the gym and taking steroids and bodybuilding and posting pictures on the internet, maybe some people think that's going to do it. But I have doubt about that as well. I think Nietzsche identified and Schopenhauer identified the ascetic and the ascetic path and the ascetic experience as really a core of, well, what Nietzsche calls the priestly, Schopenhauer calls the spiritual, and they have a difference of opinion on what exactly you should call it, but whether they're for it or against it, they're still, I think, referring to a similar thing here. They're still agreeing in some deeper way beyond the priest warrior contradiction. So I think that's what's necessary, and it's not just about physical pain either. It's about also existential pains and pushing yourself to certain limits. When you look at things you are willing to sacrifice, are you willing to sacrifice personal relationships? I was just watching a little stream. One of my viewers, a person who I haven't really directly spoken with him. He's made comments to me. I've made comments to him. We know of each other, loosely speaking. And I saw him talk about, the only way to do this or that, or that, he was just talking in general about all these different, rambling on in a very similar way that I do. And then he came to a point where he said, well, I'm not actually willing to be Amish. I'm not willing to give up what I have. I'm not ready to do that. I'm not willing to abandon kids. Look at the things around me. I have a nice job. I have a nice car. I live in a nice town. I have a nice wife. I have nice kids. So I'm kind of stuck where I am. If you are not in a spiritual place and you want to, or you want to see if such a thing is possible, or you're interested, or you're curious of pushing the bounds of this conversation past mere abstractions and dogmas and analytic expressions of syllogisms and facts and theories and science and psychology and authority and sociology, to push yourself beyond that into a new realm of psychological experience where you have a direct, imminent experience with the divine, you have to ask yourself what you're willing to sacrifice. I'll tell you that personally, I'm not someone who's really willing to sacrifice my straight edge abstinence from drugs in order to have some kind of spiritual experience. Things like PCP, ayahuasca, mushrooms, I'm not really willing to sacrifice the comfort of knowing that I am sober. I am sober-minded. I am in control of myself. I am within the law. I am being legal. All of these things, I feel safe where I am. And I'm not willing to sacrifice that feeling of safety in order to have some kind of spiritual experience induced by, drugs and mushrooms and ayahuasca and all those things, psychedelics. I'm not willing to go on LSD to have a spiritual experience because, first of all, I believe that it's unsafe. It's not legally safe. It's not safe for my health, for my sobriety, for my decision-making, as well as it can lead to a kind of trap where maybe I get addicted to those things, or perhaps it leads to a false spirituality, or perhaps it's a real spirituality, but it puts me in contact with demons and then I become a slave of Satan or something like that. So I'm not willing to do that. That's an example of something I'm not willing to do. And there are all sort of limits that we have of things we're not willing to do that inhibit us from the contact with the spiritual. So some people are not willing to sacrifice personal relationships. They're not willing to sacrifice their job. They're not willing to sacrifice familial relationships. They're not willing to sacrifice social status. They're not willing to sacrifice their connection to authority or their alignment with authority. And so there exist all of these walls around us, our sociality, our authority, that constricts us, and that we appeal to a bourgeois sense of authority that I'm not willing to do this. Because you look at people who are, like Nietzscheans, and they'll say, yeah, all we care about is power. And then it's like, okay, dude, well, where did that path lead you to? You're penniless, you're divorced, your kids have been taken away from you, you don't have visitation rights, you're addicted to drugs, you've been humiliated, you've been debased, you've been penetrated in a way. You've been dominated, you've been put in the submissive position. So your will to power, your will to do anything, your will to try anything, your will to expose yourself to anything, your will to go off the beaten path, your will to throw caution to the wind and expose yourself to the unsafe elements, whether it was drugs, a life of crime, somehow going outside the boundaries of bourgeois society, you exposed yourself to all of that. Where'd you end up? We can look at homeless, schizophrenic people. Again, the same guy I was talking about posted that video on my channel where a link to, he said, don't watch this, it's very scary. It was just a schizophrenic guy. It's just some bisexual schizophrenic guy dancing in his basement in a thong. And I guess that's supposed to be disturbing, but I don't know. When you grow up on the internet, it's hard. You get desensitized to these things, and it's like, okay, this is just a variation on something I've seen a million times before. There are still things that disturb me. I'm still sensitive to certain things more than other people. But that in itself, it's like, okay, that's what it is. And now in certain cases, it's a genetic thing. It maybe wasn't that guy's choice to go down that path. Maybe he was born that way, and genetics express themselves over time. So he might have grown up as a normal kid, and then he hits his 20s, 30s, 40s, and all of a sudden he starts hearing weird things, saying weird things, going crazy. And maybe that wasn't his choice. Maybe his DNA just implicitly had some, a period of expression that's common with psychological diseases and disorders. So it's not necessarily that he made a bad decision, but we can see the ways in which people leave the confines of bourgeois safety, and they venture out thinking that they're going to conquer the world, and then they end up on the bottom of the totem pole, and then they end up humiliated, powerless, in a worse off position they were in before. So these apprehensions that we have, which are reasonable apprehensions, inhibit us from encounters with spirituality. That we can go out and we can take drugs and break the law and engage in all kinds of breaking of barriers and boundaries in order to make contact with the spiritual. But the downside effect of that is, unless you exist in a purely schizophrenic state for the rest of your life, you eventually break contact with the spiritual. And as many schizophrenic people report, it's actually extremely painful to be in that state. And often being in that state, you're not just hearing God tell you how much he loves you, you're hearing demons talk about how they want to rip your face off. And that's hell on earth. So the idea that we want to have that as our goal, I think a lot of people would disagree with that in a very reasonable way. So then what's the compromise? Is there a compromise? Do we have to stay within secularism? Do we always have to be afraid of the spiritual? Or is there a compromise? Well, I think the compromise is religion. I think the compromise is tradition. I think the compromise is saying, okay, well, there's this spiritual realm out there. It's full of power. It's full of glory. It's full of potentiality, and we're not in it. How do we get into that spiritual realm? How do we make contact with the spiritual without ending up homeless, without ending up penniless, without ending up having destroyed all of our personal relationships, destroying all of the institutions we built up, destroying our career, making an ass of ourselves, being humiliated in the public square, looking like an idiot, really being debased and being tortured by demons? How do we avoid that? Well, it's going through these traditional paths, these traditional religions that basically say, here is the safe way to do it. Here is the way that you made contact with the spiritual in a measured, methodical way. There's a ritual to it. There's a community to it. There's a sociality and authority to it that guides you along and holds your hand and allows you to make contact with the spiritual to the extent that is possible for you without going so far into it that you lose yourself and lose contact with the quote unquote real world and really put yourself in a bad place. So that is one synthesis or answer to this problem of spirituality. And which religion is best to do that? I guess maybe there's like a Heideggerian perspective that you choose whichever religion is closest to you. If you grew up in a Christian culture, you become a Christian, you go down that path. I mean, that's alternatively, it's I can call it Heideggerian. I can also call it perennialist. But one of the issues with perennialism, and the reason I don't really talk about perennialism anymore, or one of the reasons, is because it doesn't take into account the concept of secularism and secular society as itself being another religion. Perennialism tends to have a view of secular society that secularism is anti-religion, that it is opposed to the perennial traditions, and that it doesn't matter what religion you get into, you just have to do something. And the worst thing of all is secularism because it's the absence of religion. But my question is, what if secularism is an authentic religion? And what if underneath or supporting that authentic religion of secularism is some kind of spirituality? I think the Christian would tend to say secularism is supported by the devil and demons and Satan. And that seems to be more reasonable than the perennialist who would simply say that secularism is empty and without spiritual support. You know, when you look into people like Jeffrey Epstein, it's like, well, these guys seem to be, they're not just sitting there calculating and scheming and watching their stocks rise, but they're really going off and engaging with things that are ritualistic and sadistic and symbolic and not, they're not merely like material in their nature. They're not merely quantitative, but they're qualitative. You can call them evil, but there is some kind of spirituality there, right? So then how do we interpret this? How do we interact with this? How do we understand this? You know, at least I think Christianity has, when I hear, and maybe I just haven't read enough perennialists or interacted with it enough. I mean, we're kind of seeing here what's interesting about being on YouTube and speaking my ideas and giving a voice to my ideas is oftentimes it's easy in my head to think that I know everything, even though I clearly don't. And so it's easy in my head to not have my ideas go challenged, to just say, well, I've sort of figured everything out, and where do we go from here? Well, I don't, I've analyzed everything to death, and you get yourself in a kind of stasis. Whereas when you talk out these ideas, it's like, well, I actually haven't read the perennialist, so to speak. So when I say that, Christianity by identifying demonic spirituality at the heart of secularism seems to be more real to me than the perennial idea that secularism is merely empty and without power. That seems to appeal more to me on some level. But maybe the perennialists do have some kind of deeper understanding. Maybe they would say that the spirituality animating secularism is perennialism in some kind of roundabout weird way, like, Aldous Huxley types or Crowley types. So maybe they have written about that. Maybe they would have something to say about that, but we would have to read them. We'd have to engage with them. There's a whole lot of reading to do. There's a whole lot of exploration to do. And it would take more than a lifetime, right? I could never do all of it in my lifetime. Maybe some people have figured it out, but I don't know. I can't judge. I can't decide which authority to follow. I can't decide who to put my trust in because I haven't figured it out all for myself. So if I don't have perfect knowledge of everything that's going on, then I can't identify who does have perfect knowledge unless I take it on some kind of faith or a spiritual experience with the person where I hear the words they're saying, and I don't just hear the abstract arguments that they're making, but I hear some kind of power behind the arguments. I hear some kind of charisma in the voice of the person themselves. As you get to know people more on an intimate, personal level, they begin to disappoint you, and you begin to you begin to receive random calls from random people at random hours. All right, we're going to stop that. Anyway, let's probably stop there. That's probably a sign that we should stop blabbering on. See what we can do here. I just want to put a little check in there. Put a little check in the box, and we should actually plug this in. Give me a second before I switch over. Just give me a moment here. There's a lot of things going on. A lot of distractions in this world. Let's see if we have any tabs open. Let's see if we have anything going on. Lou Pearlman. Lou Pearlman's he is an American. Let's look him up. Let's probably switch over to here. Let's exit out of this Lou and let's go over to a different Lou because that's probably going to be easy for us. Okay. So Lou Pearlman. Louis J. Pearlman, born 1954 to 2006, was an American record producer, con artist, and fraudster. He was the manager of successful 1990s boy bands such as Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. In 2006, he was accused of running one of the largest and longest-running Ponzi schemes in history, leaving more than $300 million in debts. After being apprehended, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy, money laundering, and making false statements during a bankruptcy proceeding. 2008, Pearlman was convicted and sentenced to 25 years. He died in federal custody in 2016. So he only served 8 years in jail out of the 25 years that he was sentenced to. Born in New York. His other names include Big Papa and Incognito Johnson. Interesting. So not only did he have Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, but he also had O-Town, LFO, Take 5, Natural, US5, Jordan Knight, Aaron Carter, Smilers, and South Star Sino, and Innocence. He was born the only child of Jewish parents, Hy Pearlman, who ran dry cleaning, and Renee Pearlman, a lunchroom aide. He was the first cousin of the musician Art Garfunkel, which I didn't know. He was a cousin of Art Garfunkel, part of Simon and Garfunkel. Pearl's home at Mitchell Home Gardens Apartments was located across from an airport. He became involved with blimps, wrote an autobiography, Bands, Brands, and Billions. I'm surprised he didn't include blimps in there. He used his position at the school newspaper to get a ride in a blimp. He wanted to get interested in the music business because of his cousin, Mr. Garfunkel. Managed a band and then got into aviation. Wrote a business plan for a helicopter taxi service in New York City. He launched the business based on his plan, started with a helicopter, and persuaded a German businessman to train him on blimps. He formed a company called Airship Enterprises, which leased blimps. So he was leasing blimps before he actually owned the blimp, and he used the funds which were paid for the leasing of the blimp to construct the blimp. The blimp immediately crashed, so his blimp construction skills were not very good. The two parties then sued each other. 7 years later, Pearlman was awarded $2.5 million in damages. So that's pretty cool. He scammed a person. He said, I'm going to lease you my blimp. And then the company, I guess it was Jordak Enterprises. So Jordak Enterprises says, cool, let's lease a blimp. How much is it going to cost? Pearlman says it's going to be whatever it is, 10,000, 100 million, I don't know. So then they pay him. They say, okay, well, we're going to expect the blimp next month. And he says, great. So he spends a month trying to build a blimp. The blimp crashes immediately. And then Jordak sues him because they're like, your blimp crashed. Pearlman sues Jordak, this company, Jordak. On what grounds? I'd be interested to hear. How did he sue them? And then he wins the lawsuit and he wins $2.5 million. So this guy is a professional. On the advice of a friend, he starts a new company, Airship International. took it public, raised the $3 million to purchase a blimp, claiming he had a partnership with that German businessman we mentioned earlier. He leased the blimp to McDonald's. He relocated to Florida. He signed on with SeaWorld. Airship International suffered when 3 of the aircraft crashed. So he doesn't really have a good track record. The company's stock, which was $6 a share, dropped to 3 cents a share and was shut down. Perlman became close to Jerome Rosen, a partner at a small cap trading outfit based in Queens, frequently troubled with regulators. Norbay actively traded Airship stock. This sent Airship stock higher, enabling Perlman to sell hundreds of thousands of shares at ever higher prices. However, Airship was reporting little revenue, cash flow, or net income. In return for keeping his penny stock liquid, Perlman paid Rosen handsome commissions that reached tens of thousands of dollars per trade. So here's the scheme that was going on. Just so if people don't understand the stock market, maybe you already do, but I'm going to break it down for you. Here's what happens on the stock market again and again and again. You got 2 guys, Perlman and Rosen, and they come up with a scheme. They say, okay, Mr. Rosen, you own or you are a partner at a trading company called Norbay Securities. What I want you to do is I want you to trade in my stock, Airship International. I want you to trade in my stock. When other people see you trading in my stock, they're going to say, oh, Norbay thinks this is a good stock. Let's buy, because they don't know what's going on, because no one's actually appraising the value of stocks. They're going off the authority of security firms and stockbroker firms. They're saying, okay, Norbay's buying, so we're going to buy too. This drives up the price of the stock. Now, at the same time, this company is not a real company. It's a shell company. They're not buying, they're not trading blimps, they're not flying blimps, the blimps are crashing. Nothing is actually going on. There's nothing productive in the economy going on. It's not like we're mining or we're making pencils, we're building factories. Nothing is really going on here. It's a scheme where Norbay, under the partnership of Jerome Rosen, is pumping up the price of this fake company, the fake stock. And then every time Perlman makes money off this fake company, he then pays Rosen to keep up the charade until the whole thing comes crashing down. And a lot of people lose money. But Rosen and Perlman are doing quite fine. They're quite happy with this arrangement. This is just one type of insider trading. This is the vast majority of the stock market. This is how, when you look at most rich people either get rich through copyright or stock manipulation. So for example, one form of copyright would be Elon Musk, when he abuses California law, which says, like, when you engage in research and development for alternative energy, they pay you certain tax refunds or whatever. And he abuses this law to make a lot of money at the expense of the state of California. Another one would be Microsoft, with Bill Gates, abused copyright law to shut down any competition, to create a monopoly. So it's either you creating a monopoly through some form of government regulation, or alternatively, you're just insider trading. You're scheming together, you're creating fake companies, you're driving up the price of a stock, or you're causing a crash and you're shorting the stock. So it's just about being on the inside, having connections. When you look at most rich people, they didn't create anything, they didn't build anything. They're not a genius, they just have the right connections to either law or the right financial connections. So Perlman became fascinated with the success of the New Kids on the Block, who made hundreds of millions of dollars. He started Transcontinental Records with the intent of mimicking the boy band business model. The record label's first band, the Backstreet Boys, consisted of 5 unknown performers selected by Perlman in a $3 million talent search. So just consider the fact that Perlman has thrown around $3 million before in other business ventures. So he spent $3 million basically putting out ads. Hey, do you want your kids to be a famous singer? Come to our talent search. So the parents drag these kids. Oh yeah, I want my kids to be famous. I want them to be in the hands of Lou Pearlman. And they throw them into an audition. They break a bunch of little boys' dreams. They break a bunch of little boys' hearts. You're not good enough. Next. And then finally, Out of all of these kids, they pay them like $50 a pop. Or, well, they don't pay the kids themselves. They don't pay you to audition, but they pay for the advertisement. So they're paying advertise in newspapers, and people are coming along and auditioning. And out of $3 million basically spent in advertising and having judges judge these kids, they get 5 unknown performers. Management duties were assigned to the former New Kids on the Block manager, Johnny Wright, and his wife, Donna. So Johnny Wright is an African-American gentleman, American music manager and president and CEO of the Wright Entertainment Group. He has been associated with Triple Image, Stevie Brock, Akon, Backstreet Boys, Ciara, Britney Spears, Danity Kane, Janet Jackson, Jonas Brothers, Justin Timberlake, Laurieann Gibson, NSYNC, New Kids on the Block. So this is his job. He manages these groups, whatever that means, whatever the ins and outs of managing, whatever exactly that entails. I'm not 100% sure, but that is what he does. That is what he is about. So the Backstreet Boys become the biggest, best-selling boy band of all time, $130 million in sales, hitting gold, platinum, and diamond in 45 countries. They repeat this formula almost exactly with the band NSYNC, which sells 7 million records globally. With 2 successes, he becomes a music mogul. Other 2 boy bands managed were O-Town, LFO, Take 5, Natural, US5, and the girl group Innocence with Britney Spears in the very beginning as a short-term member, co-managed with Lynn Harless, mother of NSYNC band member Justin Timberlake. Other artists include the transcontinental label include Aaron Carter, Jordan Knight, Smile South Star, C-Note. Perlman owned a large entertainment complex in Orlando, including a recording studio he called Transcontinental Studios, a dance studio near Disney World named O-Town. He wrote his book in 2002, co-written with Wes Smith. So there were some lawsuits. All of the musical acts which worked with Perlman sued him in federal court for misrepresentation and fraud. All cases against Perlman either have been won by those who brought the lawsuit against him or settled out of court. Members of the Backstreet Boys were the first to file a lawsuit, feeling that their contract was unfair because Perlman was also paid as a 6th member of the Backstreet Boys. The band's dissatisfaction came when Brian Littrell hired a lawyer to determine why the group had only received $300,000 for all their work, whereas Perlman had made millions. NSYNC was having similar issues, and members followed suit. Aaron Carter, at the age of 14, filed a lawsuit in 2002 that accused Perlman of cheating him out of hundreds of thousands in racketeering and deliberate criminal activity. This was settled out of court. So in the same year, in 2002, Perlman purchased the internet talent company Options Talent Group, formerly called E-Model and Studio 58, which would subsequently change names 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. So he continued to change the names, probably to prevent too much notoriety from going around. Oh, if you heard about this group, they're connected to Perlman, they're doing bad stuff. So this is a typical criminal practice. You just keep changing the name so no one can really keep track of all the shady stuff you're doing, regardless of the name. All incarnations were based on the business model used by E-Model founder Ayman Alec Difrawi, himself a convicted con artist who played a principal role in running the group and setting up Fashion Rock. Company received unfavorable press attention, ranging from questions about business practices to declarations they were scams. After Hot Jobs and Monster pulled the company job ads from their boards, they were advertised on the, I've never heard of this guy, Ayman Difrawi. He used his own website called Industry Magazine to advertise. Better Business Bureau's opinion was negative, citing a pattern of complaints concerning misrepresentation. The New York Consumer Protection Board issued an alert naming it the largest example of a photo mill scam. Photo mill is a modeling agency scam. The scamming agency, rather than allowing models to submit their photos from their own photographers, requires models to pay for photos taken by a photographer employed by the agency. Models are charged outrageous prices for the photos, encouraged to buy more than they actually need, After the money is collected, the agency rarely finds work for the models. So basically, you say, hey, what is their name? That we're the Wilhelmina Talent Scouting Agency. And they put down an advertisement. Do you want to be a star? Do you want to be a model? Do you want men to lust over your body? Of, whatever gender you are. Do you want men to lust over you? Come be a model with us. And it's not targeted toward the kids. It's targeted toward the parents. Do you want your kids to be lusted after? Come join our modeling agency. So you show up and they say, look, we're going to make you a star. You're perfect. We just need to take a few pictures. We're going to send them to everybody. We know all the best people. We're going to send them to everybody. We just need to take a few pictures. Are you okay with that? Can you sign off on this? Okay, great. It's just $1,200 for today. $1,200? It's just $1,200, but you're going to be a star. You're going to be making millions. I promise you. You're going to be the next big thing. And they just keep doing this to people and then never call them back. And they're just making money, money, money. San Francisco's labor commissioner declared that Perlman's group was in violation of California law. Several state agencies were reported to be investigating the company. 2,000 complaints were filed by Attorney General Charlie Crist. Sort of reminds me of Chris Christie. He was not very kind to the Kushners. So Charlie Crist, we could read about his some of his stuff later, but that would be getting off. We would be losing the plot. So anyway, Charlie Crist gets involved. Investigation is started by Mr. Dowd. No charges were filed. The newly appointed Assistant Attorney General was unable to find substantial violations. The company declared bankruptcy, leaving no funds to collect damages from. So what's the point? In 2004, Fashion Rock filed a civil suit for defamation against those who criticized Perlman. So we're going back to the origin story where he sues Jordak after the blimp he rents Jordak crashes, and he sues Jordak and he wins $2.5 million. How his lawyers accomplished that, I have no clue. But here he's like, all these people have been criticizing me. I'm going to sue you for defamation. The case was dismissed and closed in 2006, so that didn't work out too well. One of the accused, a consumer fraud expert, Les Henderson, successfully pursued a libel lawsuit against Perlman, Tollner, El Difrawi, and several others. I want to look up because this Ayman Alec Difrawi, where is this guy from? I've never heard of Ayman Difrawi. He doesn't seem to have his own Wikipedia page. What's up with that? He seems like a very look at this guy's face. Look at this guy. He looks like a real. Oh boy, well, he's got an Encyclopedia Dramatica. Is Encyclopedia Dramatica is that a legitimate source? Can we use that webpage? I'm just trying to find out about Mr. Difrawi. I just want to know. I'm just asking questions here about Mr. Difrawi. I just want to know about him. Apparently WikiLeaks was involved at some point. Oh boy. Some of these pictures of Mr. Perlman putting his arm around teenage boys leave me a little bit unsettled. So let's see if Encyclopedia has something to say. He is highly respected. Do we have, he said, spam is not illegal. The World Wide Web has become the wild, wild west. So this is interesting. This is very interesting. I can't read a whole lot of this, but people can look at this and maybe do some further research on that guy. So we continue. Difrawi filed some more lawsuits that were dismissed. 2006, investigators discovered Perlman had been running a Ponzi scheme. Oh, surprise, surprise. He used fake financial statements created by the fictitious accounting firm Cohen and Siegel. So when you're Mr. Perlman, when you're Lou Pearlman, and you say to yourself, I want to create a fake business. I want to create a fake business. And I want this business to convince people that I'm trustworthy. What should I call this fake business? I'm going to call it Cohen and Siegel. That was his choice. Those are not my words. That's just what he decided to do. I don't know why. He picked the names out of a hat. Okay, so more investigation happens in 2007. He's doing all this stuff. He flees the country. He flees to Israel. Then he goes to Germany. Then he goes to Indonesia. He's spotted in 2007 in Bali. He was reportedly seen in Russia, Belarus, Israel, Spain, Panama, and Brazil. This guy gets around. So he is ultimately convicted in 2008, declares bankruptcy. Molestation allegations. Here's probably the one that's going to throw you off. In 2008, with Howard Stern, Rich Cronin, former lead singer of LFO, said he only received a fraction of the money, claimed that Perlman wanted to bang everyone and attempted to seduce him multiple times. Cronin also alleged that those who did oblige Perlman were looked after. So this is a story about not a man who's just defrauding people, not a man who's just making money, not a man who's just in it for the cash, but he really likes teenage boys. He really likes banging them. And those who accede to his demands, he gives them a little something extra. He makes sure they're taken care of. He gives them a little more money. So then there's some other people, Brad Fischetti, who calls Perlman his friend, expresses sadness at his arrest, imprisonment, and death. Nick Carter did not confirm allegations, but hinted that bitterness might be a motivation for sexual gossip. So Nick Carter, he doesn't say it's false. He just says, they're spreading that gossip. They're spreading those rumors because they're bitter. He doesn't say it's wrong. He's just, it's really rude how they're spreading all this gossip about Mr. Perlman. It's very rude. So you can tell how Nick Carter feels about the Me Too movement when it comes to teenage boys. I'm sure he would have a different response. If a woman is talking about Harvey Weinstein, well, that's completely legitimate. We should listen and believe. But, if Rich Cronin, if a teenage boy is talking about the way in which a big, powerful man tried to bang him and used money to try to seduce him, well, then that's just gossip. That's really just rude. Lance Bass, another former NSYNC member, stated that Perlman had never behaved inappropriately with him. So we're getting some different stories out there. Some different people are saying different things. So I'm just reporting on what they have to say. He began his prison sentence. He suffered a stroke in 2010, died at 62. That's just a little thing. There's also some good examples of people who occupy the Perlman position who don't become quite as powerful. There's some documentaries out there. I don't know the names of them, but some documentaries where they do, in fact, expose themselves and engage in lewd acts, and they're eventually caught and go to jail. And you get the family's perspective. If anyone knows about those, feel free to post some names about those. But it appears at this point like the camera's blurry. I don't know why. Chat doesn't seem to be as popping off tonight as general, but probably because this topic of spirituality can get pretty dry. It's not like exciting like politics. Didn't spirituality exist in pre-Christian Rome, even ancestor worship? Yeah, I would say that. Top chat versus live chat. What's the difference between the two? I don't really know. I think top chat is supposed to eliminate spam, whereas live chat is just showing you everything. Astral projecting, is it left or right wing? That's the question. Well, is autism or schizophrenia left or right wing? I have the tendency to say that schizophrenia is left wing and autism is right wing. So I would say astral projecting is left wing. Is that a podium? Yes. It is a music cover. The pre-Socratics were spiritual. True. Animals are autistic. I cannot detect the lie. There were schizo-spiritualists in academia since about 2001. Well, explain what you mean by that. Staff of Ra says, sorry for swearing. Holy cow, I know people like this. Fourth D says, sorry for party rocking. Yeah, we have some party rocking in the house tonight. Everybody's going to have a good time. There was actually an admittedly dubious study that said a rather large percent of people don't have mental imagery or even sounds. That is crazy if true. That is crazy if true. That means I am literally a superhuman because I can close my eyes and I can hear melodies in my head. I can imitate. I can imagine the sounds of people talking or the crashing of waves, and I can see visions. I can, if I imagine, oh, what does Superman look like? Okay, so Clark Kent, he has that square jaw, he has those kind of squinty eyes, and then he's got his cape, which is red, and I can do that. Are you telling me a large percentage of people can't do that? That's pretty crazy. Jockle is saying a lot of things. He says, I have sympathies toward open individualism, essentially the understanding of consciousness of the Upanishads and physicalists like Dyson and Schrodinger, and pretty much every basement psychonaut. I've heard of Schrodinger, and I've heard of Dyson inventing a vacuum, but I don't know about their philosophies in terms of psychonautics. However, I think the non-monistic theistic view of consciousness is equally explanatory. The problem is it's not as self-glorifying. It requires a humble pill of submission to swallow. It's easy for a rich man, and Jesus would say, to accept the I am God Luciferian hypothesis. Not so easy when it comes to true Christian humility and submission. Outwardly, Ken has a pretty Petersonian conception of spirituality. Yeah, I mean, it's true. I guess what is, I don't know. I guess I've criticized Jordan Peterson in the past because I mean, obviously recent events with his personal life, kind of paint a picture of a man who doesn't really have it as all together as he made it appear. And then his constant gatekeeping in terms of saying, cultural Marxism is the problem and we need to be radical individualists. Like, I guess my biggest problem outside of all the political stuff is Jordan Peterson, his promotion of individualism. That is probably my biggest problem with him. The fact that he has no interest whatsoever in actually collectivizing any group of people. He's just like, let's just all try to exist as individuals. Like, I'm not the charismatic leader who's going to bring everybody together. I don't claim that. I don't claim that I'm going to found a group of people that we're going to all love each other and create, succeed in a minoritarian strategy. Like, I'm the guy to lead that. But I think somebody should. And if I saw something that looked promising, I would join it. And I think that is the ideal. So the fact that Jordan Peterson counter signals that kind of thing is probably my biggest problem with him. But he derives himself from Camille Paglia. He derives himself from a lot of the same sources I do. In deciding between the two, let's pull back up this nice white screen over here. Whoa, what's happening? What's going on? What is occurring in this moment? Okay, can we doubly reproduce this? Can we doubly, triply reproduce this? How deep can we go? Let's see how deep we can go here. In deciding between the two, oh, we can even triply reproduce this. We can go pretty far. We can create the change we want to see in the world. In deciding between the two, looking at the fruits of the two worldviews definitely helped me decide. Also, the position that banning something similar to, and I gotta open that up a little bit. Oh, come on. Be cooperative, sirs. There we go. How about now? Also, the position that banning something similar to drugs or alcohol isn't the most effective way to keep people away from it. I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, clearly, like, there are Muslims who drink alcohol, but alcohol consumption is way lower in the Islamic world than it is in the Western world or in East Asia or something like that. So I think bans can be effective if they are actually authentically pursued. I think that here's what I think about prohibition in America. Here is the red pill on prohibition. You hear the libertarian argue, oh, it's not effective. You can't ban anything. Here's the issue with prohibition that no one wants to talk about. There were two parts of prohibition. There was the creation of the social cultural movement, which was mostly a feminist movement. It was a movement of women who were tired and angry about the fact that husbands kept coming home and beating their wives. That was their big issue, that husbands were getting drunk and beating their wives. This is just happening every day. So they said, we need to ban alcohol. So they appealed to the government. They harassed the government. They voted for these policies to get a constitutional ban on alcohol. And they actually succeeded. They nagged people so much, and they got so much cat lady fervor behind them, and they were going and smashing things up and being violent in the same way that Antifa, basically they were the Antifa of their time. So they were doing all of this. They passed the law. And then who was supposed to enforce it? Policemen, governments, people like FDR. And these people were just not excited. They were not enthusiastic. They didn't care. I mean, in terms of high, low versus the middle, who cares if Joe Schmo is getting drunk and beating his wife? It's not my problem. The cat ladies are upset. The feminists are upset. Clearly, it's a problem for them. Clearly, they don't like getting beaten or whatever. But who cares, right? If you're actually the police commissioner, you're a governor, you're the president, who cares? So the fact is that prohibition was not effectively enforced. You can also say that versus Islam, Islam instituted a ban on alcohol, and now we're in the present day. We're talking about 1,000 years have passed. It's created a culture of abstinence. Whereas in the West, we've been drinking alcohol for a very long time. The rites of Bacchus, Dionysus was a god of wine. So the idea that we're just going to ban alcohol outright rather than trying to regulate it down and control it and things like that, the heart of the government was not in it. Laws only exist to the extent that they're enforced. Weed is a very similar thing. The law enforcement against weed is just not effective. People don't care. Whereas in Japan, it's very difficult to get weed. It is very difficult to smuggle weed into the country because the Japanese government, for whatever reason, seems to care. So really, the effective enforcement has to do with, does the government actually want to enforce it, or is the law simply on the books because a bunch of cat ladies decided that that was the right thing to do? Okay. Nietzsche was an incel, unfortunately. I don't think he was an incel. I do think he had affairs with women, but he liked to be dominated, I believe. He liked women to whip him and spank him, and that's what I hear. I don't know how much of that is true, but he wasn't a big guy. He wasn't tough. He wasn't like Martin Luther. He wasn't even like Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was pushing women down the stairs, allegedly. Schopenhauer was a very choleric man. He was a very grumpy man. Schopenhauer, again, he wasn't even like Martin Luther is really, if you're talking about people who are like theologians who are big guys, Martin Luther was a big guy, and all of his sons were warriors and knights and mercenaries. You look at the lineage of Martin Luther. Schopenhauer didn't marry. Schopenhauer didn't have kids. But even if you compare Schopenhauer versus Nietzsche in terms of their physicality, they're kind of on par, or in relation to women, whereas Nietzsche, he has quotes about which are misogynist quotes, but it seems like in his personal life, his affection, like Nietzsche had an affection for women, and he had an affiliation with dominatrixes, and he liked certain kind of women who tend to be neurotic. He liked certain kind of women, like your Rosa Luxemburg type of woman who likes to start revolutions and things. So these are the kinds of women he associated himself with. Whereas you look at Schopenhauer, he's like pushing women down the stairs, and he's like, saying things that I can't really say on YouTube. But, so I don't think Nietzsche was an incel. I think if hardcore pornography was around during the time of Nietzsche, he would have just been a coomer. So if you want to bring back Nietzscheanism, I guess you have to ban pornography. When I was a young warthog. Thank you, Goose. Maybe World War II never would have happened if he got laid regularly. Yeah, true. Well, I guess you're referring to Nietzsche here. I think if porn was around, World War II would have never happened. And I think that's why World War III will not happen, because there's just too much porn. Maybe the Chinese are capable of warfare still if their government censors porn. I don't know how easy it is to get porn in China. I've never tried. Let's smoke cigarettes and move to France. Yeah, true. That's something that everybody at some point in their life is like, yeah, I think we should just start smoking cigarettes and move to France. You know, unless you're a very steadfast, faithful, vitalistic, spiritual person, at some point everybody gets into those doldrums. People are saying hello to each other in the chat. This is some great phatic conversation we're having here. Some great social cues being exchanged. There's a great documentary on Cioran on YouTube called Emile Cioran, A Century of Writers. Well, everyone should go check that out. We see a lot of pay, pray, obey, unsophisticated Christians with very happy families. There's a case to be made that just having a family and a decent job is key to success. Ignorance is bliss. Yeah, but there's also a sense in which just doing that, like being Amish, I think is a good example of just purely like, oh, we build our little houses and we have farm and we have kids. Well, the Amish are they are very vulnerable. If the government ever decided to eliminate the Amish, it would be easy. All they would have to do is saying, new scandal, news at 11, a child abuse scandal has broken out amongst the Amish and child protective services are being sent in. And here's, you know, all these Amish community leaders, and they could create this huge thing. And who would defend the Amish? Well, you would need lawyers, right? Well, how do you get the good lawyers? Because we know the way lawyers essentially work is it's not like lawyers are like guardian angels that like walk in and they tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. No, essentially lawyers are like mentalists. They're like magicians, and to get the best ones, you have to pay a lot of money. And the government has really good lawyers, and if you want to fight the government, you have to have a lot of money to hire the best mentalists. And I don't think the Amish have a whole lot of money. I think they have enough money to sustain themselves and to grow their own population. But if the government ever decided to attack the Amish, they'd be done for. So the idea of just like having a farm, having a church, living a Christian life, that is the key to success. Well, in the long term, seems like a very vulnerable position to me. Mark Miller says, what's interesting about Cioran is he was basically pessimistic in terms his perception of reality, but still maintains some type of optimism and attitude. Yeah, I don't know about his optimism and attitude, but the feel I get just from reading some short essays by him and the vibe I get from his face is that he was a man who was kind of driven to insanity by the banality of the arbitrariness of nihilism and absurdism and randomness. And he kind of just gave a middle finger to the whole thing. And he said, you know what, if the world's going to be like this, then we're going to tear the world apart. We're going to create something great and glorious, like in spite of reality. We're going to engage in the greatest falsehoods in pursuit of glory. Like he came from the most like nihilistic, skeptical position, and he embraced fanaticism, which is interesting to see that in a singular person. Like Nietzsche is sort of responding to Schopenhauer, and he has that same dynamic, but to see it like the revolution occurring within the singular personality is interesting. Most people want authentic spirituality, but don't want to put in the personal work to get there, living aligned with truth, asceticism, practice of prayer, meditation. Joni Mitchell, if you find love, God has blessed you. If you don't, become a philosopher. That's interesting. Ken's what we call lightweight, can't wrestle with demons in the shadow realm. Yeah, true. I'm afraid of those demons in the shadow realm. No cheap grace for Ken, raw onions only. Yeah, raw onions are a form of demonic force that I do wrestle with. Where do you get your warrior priest merchant analysis from? Indo-European studies. I've never found psychedelic experiences very spiritual. Well, you know, I guess everyone's going to have a different reaction. Penetrated. I don't think I can read this because you've made too many spelling errors. Or are you ripping demons' faces off? Yeah, that would be cool. Ripping be like, demon, you think you're going to rip my face off? I'll rip your face off. You better be afraid. Yeah, sometimes you see Christians, they're like, yeah, I have power over you demons and that sort of thing. So, I mean, it goes back, as we talked about in I believe yesterday, we talked about the invocation of demons in order to wrestle with them. This was something that went on the Goetia, The Goetia was a book of spells and how to summon forth Lucifer so that you could like spit in his face and like argue with him, and this would bring you closer to God. So, I mean, the Egyptian monastics of the third century were doing this. They would go into the desert and they would have like visions of demons, and they would like be having kung fu, like Dragon Ball Z fights with these demons, and kind of cool stuff. Psychedelics are for spiritual experience as prostitutes or masturbation is to sexual experience. Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. Although people do report actually encountering certain entities, during their psychedelic experiences. But I guess you could say, yeah, obviously I don't use psychedelics, so I'm not going to be the best defender of them, but there are defenses of psychedelics out there. I had a psychedelic spiritual experience and it turned me crazy smart. Yeah, Randy, you are pretty smart. Fourth D says, dude weed. Randy, yeah, actually, and not ironically, drugs are bad. Well, that is my position, but I know people disagree with me. I've been fighting with drug people all my life. They're constantly telling me, oh, try this, try that, do this, do that. And it's like, why do you want me to do it so bad? It's almost like when you're a pig, you want to cover everyone else in filth to bring them down to your level so you don't feel ashamed by your own filth. That's kind of how I perceive that. But maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, AJ is very sexual, and he can't even spell penetrate correctly. So I'm not going to read that. Epstein had more than his share of counterparts in the Catholic clergy. True. We are all the Epsteins of modernity. I don't know what that means. Explain that to me, fourth density. Perlman, what kind of name is that? Well, it's a very aquatic name, right? It's related to oysters. So maybe his ancestors were like working class, like shellfishers. Maybe that's what they were into. He was probably like, you crashed my blimp. Yeah, exactly. Perlman's like, what did you guys do? And they're like, well, he's a big man, so I don't know if he would have that voice. But they're like, dude, your blimp crashed. Like, what is wrong with you? You guys crashed my blimp. I'm gonna sue you guys. And then he's like, yeah, they totally crashed my blimp. Yeah, lawyer, tell the judge, tell him how they crashed my blimp. Those terrible people. Thank you, Randy, for explaining to me. That makes perfect sense. Okay, chat has scrolled down a little bit, so we got to scroll back up. Oh boy, we're totally lost now. Baby Yoda blimp, true. Ha, Rosen. I wonder what kind of name is that. Well, Rosen, I think that has to do with roses. So probably his ancestors were like working class gardeners, is what I'm gonna guess. Jockle says it's a last name. True. It is a last name, the Mammon Mindset. Yeah, the Mammon Mindset's should write a book called Mammon Mindset. Elon Musk is a scathing condemnation of Anglo-capitalism. His existence, I guess, yeah, the fact that he is a rich man kind of makes you doubt, like, does Anglo-capitalism actually reward people like a meritocracy, or is this just about putting scam artists in charge of our society? Origin, Jockle says, it's probably the origin is Earth. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's what Jockle would say. I used to follow a subreddit called Carl H. Programming. He was an awesome educator. Turned out he was producing bad stuff and doing bad stuff, if I recall correctly. Then he killed himself in prison. Well, that sounds like an exciting story to look into. Carl H. Programming. I know we shouldn't. The darks. Oh, geez. Carl. Oh, no. His name is Carl Harold. Jockle, you're not doing yourself favors here. Okay. What are we going to read here? He was Redditor of the Day in 2009. He said, I love spending time with my family. He locked his son in a cage. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Okay. A lot of people apparently liked this guy. All right, let's I'm trying to read something, but this is trying to read something. Greatest internet story. Carl H. was a victim of an internet smear campaign. He had to deal with losing his company. He turned to the users of Reddit. He stated his case. The users of Reddit went to work. The number one listing in Google was replaced by a relevant site. Okay, so this is the positive effect of social media. Can anyone I want, where's the internet encyclopedia? News article. Thank you, Shartina Oduris. Thank you for sharing the news article. Carl Harold. Okay, you look at this guy, Carl. I didn't intend to we're bringing up people tonight. We're looking at Carl Harold. We're looking at what kind of guy Carl Harold was. We're looking at pictures of the face of Carl Harold. This is a participatory experience that you need to oh my goodness. Oh no, we're looking at the side profile of Carl Harold. We're looking at the hair of Carl Harold, this there of the eyes of Carl Harold. Does this dude have a Wikipedia? He should have a Wikipedia. No, there's just some ancient German dude from 1848. We're not talking about that. An Alabama man accused of doing bad stuff with his young son was found dead. It's really shocking to me. He had great spirits. He seemed to be continuing to fight his case. The 33-year-old was arrested in 2013, had a computer programming background, and ran a popular YouTube channel. Oh boy, we're going to go to the YouTube channel. Yeah, probably YouTube has taken the videos down, right? If we search Carl Harold, probably not going to be still around here. Oh, my name is Carl Harold. Why does this guy not get banned from YouTube? Why do I get strikes, but this guy is still on YouTube? What is going on here? Carl Harold, his most popular video has 848,000 views. How to subtract binary numbers. Let's see. There are people still. Let's listen to his voice.
Okay, so in the last lesson,
Okay, that's enough of that voice. Okay, we're getting positive comments. We're getting negative comments. Let's see when this guy came around. 7 years ago. Let's see. His newest video was made 6 years ago. Let's see. Oh boy, he's in a Skype chat. This is interesting. He sounds so sweet. It just stresses me out.
So here's what I wanted to do for today. I wanted to go ahead and
So this is the voice. This is the voice of an Alabama man who had a popular YouTube channel, said the 9-year-old son was not enrolled in school. They think he was kept in the man's home without interaction from outside for 8 months. He faced 18 charges, which you can read about. He was indicted in New York where he lived, forcing all kinds of bad stuff I don't even really want to read about. Harold's domestic partner, Charles Dunavant. How did the alleged abuse began in 2011 when the child would have been 7? I have to be very careful with what I say here, but I'm just asking a curious question. How did two men, Carl Harold and Charles Dunavant, acquire a child and begin abuse in 2011 when the child would have been 7. How did they acquire? How did two men? Because obviously, two men cannot reproduce sexually, right? Am I right? Am I still correct about that? Is that politically incorrect to say two men cannot reproduce sexually? So where did they acquire this child? Was it adoption? Was there a mother involved? Who was the mother? What does the mother think about all of this? I don't even know where to begin to. Who is the biological father of the child? Carl Harold. Where's the mother at? Where's the mom at? Smith testified the boy's mother lives in Wyoming. She is separated, at least physically, from Harold. Disable your ad blocker. Okay. Gosh, can I refresh the page and do that? Yeah, I'm going to do the little trick there. Okay, so we're looking at the mother. I really want to understand where the mother is. The boy stayed with his mother during the trip turned 9 on Space Mountain. I love and miss my son very much. Described a trip Harold took with business to Disney World with the boy. Police investigator. Wonder how they found out. How did they discover who found this out? Smith testified. So who is Smith? I need to figure out who Smith is. Chad Smith. Represent a risk of flight. So police investigator Chad Smith. Thank you, Chad. Literally, his name is Chad Smith. Police investigator Chad Smith, also drummer for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Chad Smith, who looks like, you know what comedian he looks like if you look up Chad Smith. He looks like that guy from Anchorman actor. Who's the actor in Anchorman? Remind me of Will Ferrell. Dude, Chad Smith looks exactly like Will Ferrell. And people already know this. People have already posted about this. But anyway, Chad Smith, who also looks like some other guys who I don't remember. Oh, Ron Perlman. Here's another. It's all coming back to Perlmans, right? You go deep enough into one Perlman, you eventually get to another Perlman. Ron Perlman looks like Chad Smith, who looks like Will Ferrell. Are people seeing this right now? I'm just obsessed with faces. This is where my autism comes out, is it within the faces. So thank you for Chad Smith. Chad Smith somehow found out about all this. He gave no graphic details. Concentrate on evidence that Harold lived in Huntsville less than 9 months. No ties to the community. Has a history of moving around the country. Ability to flee and possibility of flight. Okay, Smith testified. Smith testified the boy's mother lives in Wyoming. She is separated from Harold. Other sources said she is not in the picture as far as parenting. So he's not described as a stepson. He's described as a son. So it seems to me that Carl Harold had a child with a woman who now lives in Wyoming. The woman, for whatever reason, is not in the picture as far as parenting. Carl Harold then hooked up with a quote-unquote domestic partner called Charles Dunavant. And Charles Dunavant and this guy, Carl Harold, got together, started abusing their son and distributing videotapes with other such people. You hate to hear it, but it's very similar when you had that Australian. I can't even say this. I'm not even allowed to say this on YouTube, but I'm gonna type it. I'm gonna type it into Google. See how quickly this comes up. Certainly not on the first page of YouTube. Yeah, it's not coming up on the first page of YouTube. It used to be a big story. Sydney Morning Herald. Mark Newton and his boyfriend Peter Truong adopted a child. They paid a Russian woman $8,000 to be a surrogate mother in 2005. For 6 years, the couple traveled the world, offering this child up for sex with 8 men, recording the abuse to an international syndicate known as the Boy Lovers Network. Sounds like NAMBLA with Allen Ginsberg. I think this is probably the worst ring, if not the worst ring I've ever heard of, said Brian Bone of the United States Postal Inspection Service. Truong and Newton gave an interview to an ABC reporter in Queensland in 2010 about their battle to have a child as a gay couple. So they acquired this child in 2005, and then in 2010 they went on ABC and talked about, oh, what a terrible struggle it was trying to acquire this child. Their search started in 2002. They didn't have any success, and then they found a woman with whom they clicked. She was paid $8,000, and she granted the couple's sole custody of the boy, handing him over after 5 days after he was born. So they went through a whole struggle of the adoption process. Yeah, so they did an interview 20 months before their arrest. I think the arrest happened in 2010 is what the date was. 20 months before their arrest, so almost 2 years. Newton was asked in a radio, because this guy, all the media love, oh, you guys, you struggled, you suffered, you're persecuted. So the interviewer says to Newton, they say, do you feel like you guys are under extra scrutiny because the authorities suspect there's something dodgy, something pedophilic going on here? Newton replies, absolutely. I'm sure that was the concern. They're discriminating against because they think that gay men, all they think about is sex. Well, it's just I don't know what to call. I don't know. It's not a coincidence. I don't think you call it a coincidence. I don't know what you call it. You call it a tragedy. You call it a travesty. You call it bad stuff. You call it stories that seem to happen over and over again. They get a little bit of attention. They're called conspiracy theories. They're swept under the rug. Nobody cares. No one wants to hear about them. I don't even want to talk about this. I don't want to cover this. I don't want to discuss this. This is not enjoyable for me. But it clearly exists. And I don't know what can be done about it, except to tell women, don't, $8,000 is not worth the consequences. What do you think, that Russian woman who sold her child for $8,000, how do you think she feels right now? Maybe she's a sociopath. Maybe she doesn't care. Maybe she's dead. Maybe she used $8,000 to purchase meth or heroin or whatever, crocodile or whatever is popular in Russia. But maybe the only thing to do is just educate women and tell women, do not sell your children. That is what adoption is. Adoption is selling your children. It's terrible. Okay, well, let's try to move on to something a little less disturbing. John Smith says autism isn't real, and psychiatric literature even admits it's not a biologically valid concept. Okay, well, it's a useful concept, so I don't really care. Jockle, interesting name there, yeah. I'm not a fan of the Peterson bashing. I think he's done great things for the world. Everyone has their faults. Okay, but here's the thing. I prefer BAP over Jordan Peterson. I prefer someone who's like, let's get together and be something. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're saying, let's get together and be the, Richard Dawkins fan club, or let's get together and let's be Christians. Let's get together. Let's be Buddhists. Let's be Hindus. Let's be Taoists. Let's join Falun Gong. Let's join some crazy organization. As long as people are getting together and working together and trying to do something, I have more respect for that than when Jordan Peterson says, you should never have pride for anything outside yourself, and you should never collectivize, and, you should be an individual. Like, that to me seems to be a non-starter, and it seems to me to be poisonous. So whatever other truths or good things he's saying in the abstract, whatever arguments he's making for religion or whatever, I would prefer a group of atheists who are like, who believe in the power and the value of sociality, versus Peterson, who shames some people, not all people. Not all people. He doesn't care about certain groups of people that form collectives and social groups. But if other people do that, well, then that's very problematic, right? So I guess I have more sympathy towards someone who's like, yeah, God is stupid. Or like, I guess Nietzsche is an individual, but, someone who's saying, yeah, God is dead, but, we should still have some kind of group identity, group conception of ourselves, because I think sociality is key. I think if you don't exist as a social person, you don't really exist at all, which is part of the genocide of our modern age. If people are not being killed physically, they're being killed socially. People no longer have a social identity. They feel alienated from the mainstream. That is the social genocide that is going on, that is problematic, that Peterson is a part of. Whether I agree with him on theology or whatever doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, or is seemingly less important. Does anyone else have this thing where if you listen to a particular speaker for a long time, you begin to think in their voice, speech rhythm and all? Yeah, I've heard of that. It was less when you read books, you read the author's voice in your voice. And then when you hear them read their own book, it's kind of weird. You should add your screen to OBS so we can see what you're looking through, Wikipedia, articles, and pictures. Yeah, I could do that, although I'm not using OBS when I stream through YouTube. It's just through my webcam. I could probably figure that out, but I haven't bothered to do that because I don't trust the internet and Google search. I don't trust it on YouTube that it's just going to display the pictures I want to find. It's probably going to depict other pictures as well. So that's kind of why I don't screen share. So the law alone is not effective. It needs to have a culture which supports the law. Yes, and yeah, that's one way to put it. Cannabis use is more common in Japan than you might expect, though, despite the extreme penalties for getting caught. Yeah, I'm sure some people do it, but it's just I'm just saying that as a blanket statement. The idea that prohibition doesn't work is a ridiculous position. Prohibition works. It doesn't work absolutely, but it works. It's the same argument about walls. Do walls work or do they not work? Well, they clearly work, right? Especially if once the people get inside, you provide negative incentives for them to leave. Cannabis use, we already read that. Schopenhauer is a PUA who would attempt seduction by performing magic tricks. If that is true, that's kind of funny. But he was probably a misogynist. Also, in places like Japan and China in particular, with these strong laws, there are alternative drugs legally available. Yeah, that's true. I'm talking about prohibition in general. Like, obviously, I think prostitution is pretty readily available in Japan. So it's not like, I'm not saying they're a hyper-puritanical society. I'm not saying Puritanism in general works. I'm just saying that if you want to stop something, you have to want to stop it. You can't just have a law that says we're going to stop it and then not do anything about it. Apparently, John Smith says there are pornographic websites which are popular in China. I'd like to see data for that because I just don't know anything about it. All right, we got to scroll back up. Nietzsche fell out with Wagner because Wagner suggested to Nietzsche's doctor that his illnesses were caused by excessive masturbation. That's funny. But also Wagner legitimately did soften his pagan eroticism that is clearly present in some of his earlier works, and then later he turns toward chastity. So Nietzsche is making a legitimate observation, though. Now, whether that's something good or bad is entirely different. But I don't think it was solely about that. But that's an interesting personal tidbit. Yeah, I don't know what the status of pornography in China is. I'm not quite exactly sure about it. Porn is apparently banned in Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Hashtag Intermarium. Yeah, I don't know about that because I think the European Union has certain standards about if you're part of the European Union, you have to allow some freedom of internet and freedom of art, I think is how they describe it in the law. So I don't believe Lithuania is part of the EU. I don't know that they're allowed to ban porn under EU regulations. I know the EU is not the biggest proponent of freedom of speech, but I'm pretty sure that's a part of it. Juan de la Lastra, endlich mal ein passendes Video zur Adventzeit, gutes Video. Dankeschön, Herr Lastra. Elon Musk LARPs as a pioneer, but is actually a snake oil salesman. Yes. Michael is upset about the story that we covered, as I was. Definitely affected my view of humanity when I found out about Carl, since I was using his subreddit and watching his vids for a while before his news came out. Yeah, it's like you identify with somebody, you like someone, and then you find out they're a bad person, and it kind of makes you question your own ability to perceive morality and evil. You thought it was something that would be obvious, and then you yourself sort of participated or liked or supported someone who you found out was really bad. And then it's like, well, who am I? And am I somehow tainted by this? And like, how can we, if we cannot even discover and detect evil, how can we ever hope to eradicate it? You know, we can't hope to eradicate it. It is eternal. Unless you're a Christian who believes Christ is going to come back and destroy all evil eternally. But if you're of a perennial mind, cyclical mind, then it's here to stay. The actor from Anchorman, it's Quentin Tarantino, idiot. Yes. So I can't believe I forgot Quentin Tarantino again. Who's he talking about? Who is Mark Newton? Never mind. I know what he's talking about. Perversion is one thing, but the premeditated nature of finding someone to create a child with which you will abuse is deeply troubling. Yes, it is deeply troubling. However, it seems to be more common than we'd like to think. I think Lou Pearlman is another example of that. And there are many other cases, many other examples. You know, Harvey Weinstein, Anthony Weiner. All of this is proof of spiritual evil. Amen. Yes, evil exists. Surrogacy is a bad idea. I bought my puppy and he is taking a nap at my feet. Okay. In what sense is autism a useful concept other than as a meme? Well, memes are useful concepts. So, I mean, you've listened to me talk about autism and I've been describing it as a meaningful concept. So that's the sense in which it is useful. Go back and watch and listen to what I say. I'm not going to repeat myself. High-low verse middle singularity. It seems Ken has hit some kind of wall. He now streams analyzing Satanists. Yeah, I'm constantly hitting walls. I'm like a mime. There are constantly walls around me. The viewership is down. We've only got 23 views, 13 thumbs up. So we're definitely hitting all kinds of walls in all kinds of directions. We are increasingly, the walls are closing in. My perception is smaller and smaller. Viewership smaller and smaller. The channel is collapsing. Everything is being destroyed. The Atlantis is sinking. You know, climate change. The sea level is rising. So, yeah, there's definitely bad stuff going on. The end is nigh. We'll say that the end is nigh. If Jordan Peterson is about not having pride in anything but himself, is he proud of his children or his parents? Good question. Singularity. Book recommendations for persuading one out of the materialist determinist hole. Yeah, Bible. Which is what Mr. Guttam says, New Testament. And then he says non-religious texts. Well, bro, if you don't want to be a materialist determinist, maybe you're going to, and you want to read something, maybe the content of what you're going to be reading is religious. That is, I don't know. If you want to read something non-religious, read Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Heidegger. I mean, I would say Schopenhauer is the most anti-materialist, pro-spirituality person who is not explicitly religious. Brian G says Plato's Republic. The kind of immunological response that people have to religion is something that seems to be more of an impediment than something which is useful. Any particular translator? Is it important? I always recommended Gruba's translation as the best by a philosophy professor. Thank you. Watching Jordan Peterson is depressing. Yeah, he's not very exciting. Got to hit them walls, boy. Yep. Well, we've certainly hit some walls. It is 2:24, 2 hours 25 minutes now. That is it. That is the end of the stream. Thank you for listening, watching, participating, and commenting. Not one of the most exciting or happy or interesting streams we've done, but we did it, and now it's over, and we'll go on to do bigger and better things. Michael says, wait. I will wait exactly. You have exactly 30 seconds on the clock. Question: what do you think about... Okay, what do you get when you combine the end of the stream with somebody who wants to... Yeah, Michael is bluffing. Okay. Yep. All right. That's it. Thank you for bluffing, Michael. You extended the stream by about 20 seconds there. Congratulations. Okay, so until next time, I will see you later. Goodbye.